Okay, chapter 13, sustainability reporting. So sustainability has really two different meanings in business. Sometimes people, when they say sustainability, they're talking about financial sustainability. So how viable is this company from a financial standpoint? And this is really important because any organization that is not financially sustainable is going to come to an end, one way or another. It's either going to fail, get purchased, one way or the other, it will no longer exist. But sustainability also refers to environmental sustainability or socially sustainable. So in other words, how is the organization viewed by society, and what's its role in the overall environment, especially the ecological environment? Okay, so don't let that confuse you. Sustainability can mean different things. It's always having to be sustainable, but what are we talking about? Sustaining finances? Are we talking about sustaining the environment or the image of the company? So in this chapter, we're going to basically address all of this. So we'll talk about what sustainability is, and we'll talk about stakeholders. I'm pretty sure you're familiar with that concept, and the information that stakeholders need and use in order to help an organization. We'll talk about different sustainability initiatives and future issues in sustainability. Okay, so sustainability, as I just said, it's being able to sustain something. Now, corporations these days typically are supposed to be ongoing. When corporations were first a thing, they've been around for hundreds of years, but for most of their history, when a corporation was allowed to exist by the state, because the state has to authorize a corporation, it would be for a period of time. And it's only in the last, I don't know, 100 or so years, so basically throughout the Industrial Revolution, that we have decided that, hey, corporations could just be an ongoing thing that could potentially live forever. So these days, corporations themselves are expected to be sustainable, meaning able to continue on even once the founder of the company is long gone. Theoretically, the corporation can continue. And that applies whether it's a nonprofit or a for-profit. And then we've got CSR, corporate social responsibility. This is a broad term. It means that the corporation is responsible to society, and there's a whole spectrum of ways you could interpret this, going all the way from saying just a corporation just has to follow the laws. That would be pretty simple. Or to saying, no, a corporation has to do a lot more than follow the laws. It really has to address the needs of all of its stakeholder groups. Okay, so whatever your definition is, realize that it may not be the same as everybody else's definition. So what you consider socially responsible, somebody else may disagree with. I would say that at a basic level, every corporation should treat its employees fairly, should produce a product or service that adds value to their customers, and should try to return some profit for their investors or owners. That would be a real basic level of social responsibility, in addition to following the laws. Some say that social responsibility can include philanthropy, actually giving money to charities, or having a social venture where your efforts are not just to make a profit, but you're actually trying to create a product that solves some problem within society. So many different definitions of what social responsibility can be. There are different ways to report how sustainable a company is and how socially responsible a company is. We'll talk about some of the different ways that have been developed to sort of standardize these reports, but there's really not a lot of standardization out there currently. So you will have a lot of companies that say, hey, we're socially responsible, or we are environmentally friendly, but you have to really figure out what they mean by that to know if they're telling the truth, or if it's just window dressing. In some cases, they might use a less harmful type of plastic in their bottles, and now they say, oh, we're environmentally friendly. And then you can be the judge of, are they really environmentally friendly, or they're just not, as unfriendly as they used to be. Okay, so we'll talk more about reporting later on. So let's talk about sustainable business practices in general. By being sustainable, companies can sometimes save money. For example, Walmart had some big initiatives to decrease its carbon footprint and become more environmentally sustainable, and actually found some ways to save money in the process. So going green is not always more expensive than the status quo. Sometimes through your sustainability, you find ways to reduce your insurance costs because you're operating more safely and more efficiently. You can maybe attract investors. I have had clients in the past who were wanting to invest only in companies whose values aligned with their own values. So then I would have to do some research to figure out, okay, here are some investments that follow certain guidelines, and then, okay, here are the values you have said are important to you, and match those up. So then, in addition to just looking at how they could make money with their investments, also factoring in their values. So that's a whole field of socially responsible investing that is developing. It's most individual investors are not really that concerned or interested in it. Even the ones that you might think that they would be interested in it, there's not a lot of demand for it, but a lot of institutions are. So there are a lot of big pension funds and universities and other organizations that have a lot of money to invest, and they say, we don't want to invest in fossil fuels. We don't want to invest in companies that support genocide, or whatever their values might be. And then their financial advisors have to build them portfolios accordingly. Now, another way to be sustainable is to not discriminate, because companies that discriminate, they tend to get into lawsuits, or they get bad press, or they have complaints with the Labor Department. So that's another way to be a more sustainable business. Customers often like to support those companies whose values are congruent with their own values. So you might find that your sales increase if you are more sustainable. You might find that regulators are going easier on you if you are doing a better job of being sustainable. You might find it's easier to attract and retain employees because they feel good about the way you're running your company. You might find the community in general has a better relationship with you. And then you might have less of a carbon footprint, less pollution, and therefore be more environmentally sustainable. So you see right here on this slide, we've really looked at the major stakeholder groups, except for maybe suppliers and creditors, but most of the major stakeholder groups are identified here, and how sustainability in a company can benefit those different stakeholder groups and improve the relationship between the company and the stakeholders. So any comments or questions? Okay. Here are some examples. Union Carbide. If I recall correctly, this is related to Union 76. I think it's I think Union Carbide was a parent company of Union 76. I can't tell you for sure. I'd have to look it up. But there was a big problem they had with a plant that they owned in India. And there was an accident at the plant. The chemicals that came out of this accident created a cloud that floated over a local town or village and caused a lot of illness to the local population. So there's one example of how a company's either negligence or even just an accident that maybe could not have been prevented, whatever might be the cause, either way, their operations can influence the local public, potentially in a negative way. We've seen it here with PG&E, right? Remember in San Bruno years ago, they weren't maintaining their gas lines or something along those lines, and there was an explosion, right? A whole neighborhood basically blew up, right? And you remember that? San Bruno? Yeah, it was what, 5 years ago or so? It wasn't that long ago. Yeah.
Is that North Snow?
No, it's up by San Francisco. South of San Francisco. Yeah. Yeah. And then look at with the wildfires, right? A lot of these recent fires, PG&E started when they shut off the power to prevent the fire, right? And then they turned the power back on, not knowing that power lines had fallen onto the ground. And then once the electricity hits those power lines, it goes up in flames, right? So companies have to be really careful. You know, they need to know what they're doing. I was just watching this series on Netflix called, okay, I don't know what it was called, but it's all about biohacking and genetic modification. And there are a lot of people out there experimenting with biohacking, meaning they're experimenting with DNA and putting it not only into animals and plants, but also into other humans. It's scary stuff. They're not doctors, they're not scientists, and they're out there experimenting with DNA, making like rats that glow in the dark and all kinds of weird stuff. It's a little scary, right? Organizations really need to be responsible, so do individuals, and think about what kind of consequences there are if they are not following safety precautions with their production. Nestle is another example. I know with Nestle, there have been a lot of issues about water where they'll come into a community and buy out the water rights, and then the local people don't have access to that water. And Nestle's like selling it, they're putting it in bottled water and bottles and selling it. But another big scandal they had in Central or South America, well, it doesn't say, it just says developing countries, is they wanted to sell more baby formula. So they were going into communities where people didn't use baby formula. And they would say, here's some free baby formula. Give this to your babies. And so the mothers would take it, give it to their babies and say, okay, hey, this is great, thinking that their baby's getting a better nutritionally balanced product. There were some problems with this. For example, sometimes the women would add water to it in order to dilute it and make it go further. But adding water, if the water itself wasn't safe in that community, that caused problems with the baby's health. Another problem is some of these women were using formula long enough that they stopped producing milk. And then when they ran out of formula and it was no longer available for free, they were kind of stuck because they couldn't afford the formula. So now how do they feed their baby? So there was a lot of uproar about this, and Nestle said, okay, we're not going to do that anymore. And they put all kinds of programs in place to try to better, we'll try to salvage the situation and provide like training on breastfeeding and things like that. But the damage had already been done. There's another example, there's a good example, I'll tell you. Levi Strauss. They found out that somewhere in South America, I want to say it was Honduras, they had a place that was making their pants. And they found out that some of the kids working there were underage. And they did the right thing. They said, no, we're not going to allow that. But they also realized that if they just fired these kids, there was a problem because these kids needed to earn money to help support their families. So here they don't want to support child labor, but at the same time, they don't want to support the kids and create an economic hardship. Is anybody familiar with this case and what Levi did in this example? They decided to tell the kids, okay, you cannot work for us anymore. You have to go to school. We're going to continue paying you while you're in school. Once you're done with school, then you can come back and you'll have a job with us. So that cost them money, right, to fund these kids' educations, basically. But it was the right thing to do because they had found themselves in a situation where there was no good answer except to cut into their profits and do the right thing, you know, for these kids in their communities. Another example of sustainability was Johnson & Johnson. You might know the famous case with Tylenol. This is back, I think, in the 70s. Doesn't say here, but I think it was the 70s. I should really get my facts together on some of these cases. But so what happened was somebody was tampering with Tylenol. They were opening it up, lacing it with cyanide, and closing it back up and putting it on the store shelves so people would buy Tylenol. And it says 24 people actually died from taking this contaminated Tylenol. So Johnson & Johnson did the right thing when they found out about this. Now they had no way of preventing this because they didn't know some crazy person was going to do this. But the way they reacted was admirable. They immediately pulled all of their products off the shelves nationwide. They said, okay, instant recall, don't sell any more of our product, which cost them money because then people going to the store would buy the competitor's product. But it was the right thing to do because it prevented any further deaths. And then what they did is they came up with the tamper-proof, caps that we all know and love today, where you have to push down and turn it, right? So plus they put a seal. In fact, there's an image right here. So they put this seal on there so that nobody could do that anymore. There was no way you could poison the Tylenol. So they did the right thing, and even though that lost them some sales in the short term, in the long run, they salvaged their reputation. Now, scoot forward a couple decades to today, and Johnson & Johnson is in a new scandal. Anybody know what it's related to? PayPal? Oh, baby powder. Okay. Oh, with the asbestos in there. Yeah. So I've heard about that. Is that what you're going to say, Kyle? So there's that. But you know what else? The opioid crisis. They are actually one of the companies that was making very addictive opioids and supposedly knew about it and made a lot of money off of getting people addicted, supposedly. So we'll see how that plays out in the courts. Johnson & Johnson went from being a very highly ethical, very respected organization to today, well, we'll see. They've got some crisis control to do. So here are examples of different companies that have had issues that they've had to then report to the public on what was going on. And in some cases, they did a good job of salvaging their brand image. In some cases, they did not. Okay, so there arose this concept of the triple bottom line. So enough people got tired of this argument over whether corporations have to be socially responsible. And some people started to say, you know what? Corporations need to focus not only on profits, they also need to look at their impact on people and their impact on the planet. So people, profit, and planets, people, planet, and profits is what I meant to say, is the triple bottom line. Okay, so that's looking not only at the profit bottom line, which is your net income, or, well, let's just say net income. Not only looking at profits, also looking at how does your organization impact people, how does it impact the planet. Okay, so if in business you hear this term, the triple bottom line, or you hear people, planet, profits, that's the concept. Let's step back for a second and I'll tell you about the underlying theories. Because there are economists who have widely different views on this. In one camp, you have neoliberal economists. And they are of the mindset that the corporation should really just focus on profits. And as long as it is following the law, it doesn't have to worry about ethics or social responsibility because its job is just to make profits for its investors. This is sometimes referred to as neoliberal economics. It's referred to as the Austrian school or the Chicago School of Economics because of where these ideas came from. The most famous economist in the United States who was a proponent of this concept is Milton Friedman. Let's see. He's in here somewhere. Okay, I'll go back to where I was. So Milton Friedman said that the social responsibility of business is to use its resources to increase profits as long as it stays within the rules of the game and engages in free competition without deception. So basically what he said, as long as you're following the law, the socially responsible thing to do is make as much money as possible for your investors. If I can summarize and paraphrase what he said. Okay, that's Milton Friedman. He's at one extreme. You go to another extreme and you have a guy who comes along. His name was R. Edward Freeman. So you've got Friedman and you've got Freeman, okay? Can be a little confusing. So Freeman without a D, he said, no, there's something called stakeholder theory. He's basically the person he didn't come up with the term, but he made stakeholder theory famous and really developed it. And what he said is that corporations can return the greatest profits not by focusing only on their investors, but by paying attention to all stakeholder groups. So his argument wasn't just that corporations should be nice and should just do good things. His argument was that to be as profitable as possible, don't just focus on investors. Focus on what do your customers need, what do your employees need, what does the public need, and by doing that, you're going to be more profitable. Okay, and these are theories. Nobody's been able to say 100% that one is right or one is wrong. But you have neoliberal economics on one end, you have stakeholder theory on the other. Okay, so this concept of the triple bottom line really is an offshoot of stakeholder theory, saying you have to look at all of your stakeholders, not just your investors. All right, so keep that in mind. And as you go in your career, work for different companies, you're going to find some that have that sort of holistic view, that realize that sustainability does require paying attention to all of your stakeholders, and others who I feel have been pretty much proven wrong, but who try to maximize short-term profits by focusing really only on their investor needs. To me, it seems pretty cut and dry, the difference between the two. Maybe I'm biased, but I'm certainly more in favor of stakeholder theory. Okay, so what are the different areas where corporations can report on sustainability? They can report on their impact on the environment. And we have ways to estimate now things like your carbon footprint and the amount of pollution that you are creating. So a lot of companies are doing that. Again, it's not really that well standardized, but there are ways to report on environmental sustainability. You can report on your relations with your employees. You can report on human rights. A lot of companies that operate internationally don't always have the best human rights records when you look at their actions overseas. So even companies like Apple, you know, they've come under criticism to the treatment of the employees of their contractors in China and the working conditions for those employees. They're not Apple employees, but Apple contracts to companies like Foxconn that then hire people and put them in basically sweatshop sort of conditions. And then Apple comes under fire for that because they should better manage what their supplier is doing in terms of human rights. Also philanthropy, that's another thing you can report on. How much charitable giving did we do? How much did we donate to different charities? All right, so here we can see some of these in more detail here. So some environmental things companies can report on, how much material they use, right? We've seen how much packaging companies use these days. I got something in the mail the other day. It was, they were like little replacement heads for a sonic toothbrush, which unfortunately I went to 3 or 4 different stores. They don't sell it locally, so I had to order it online. And it was this big. It was this big. It came in a box like this, right? It's a lot of wasted cardboard and bubble wrap and plastic, right? Just so I could get this little product. So how much material organizations use either in shipping or in production, or especially hazardous materials. These are all things companies can control and report on. How much energy they use. One good thing about gas prices when they go up is then gas usage goes down, at least to some degree. So the more fossil fuels go up, the more quickly that'll motivate people to move towards alternative sources of energy. Impacts on local communities. Like if you've got a company that's dumping their waste into a river, that impacts the local community, right? Decades ago, rivers throughout much of the United States were clean. And you probably know these days there aren't that many rivers that you would want to drink out of in the United States, right? Because there have been so many pollutants that have gone into them. Larger regional impacts, biodiversity. There's a typo there, but around here we've got a lot of preserved wetlands, which is great. Wetlands are really important. Down in Los Angeles, near where I used to live, they'd gotten rid of a lot of the wetlands and they built up buildings. They did this out near New York City. They just kept building and building closer and closer to the shore. But then what happens when you get something like a Hurricane Sandy coming in, you don't have that cool water and whatever trees and foliage is growing there to slow down the storm. So that means the storm is coming and boom, right away it's hitting the community. And I don't know if you remember Hurricane Sandy, but a lot of houses got swept away, right? The water came all the way up to the subway system in New York. So the subways were flooded, right? And a lot of that, well, it was in part because of climate change and bigger storms, but it was also because the biodiversity in wetlands had been washed out. So it's important. We have here in California things like the what is it called? The Delta smelt. It's a little fish in the Colorado River. And the conservationists were saying we need to protect this little fish. And therefore we cannot use too much of the water from the river, and the farmers were saying, yeah, but we need that river water. Who cares about these little fish? Well, the thing is, if one element of an ecosystem gets destroyed, that can throw the whole ecosystem out of balance. You might have heard the story or seen the documentary about Yellowstone Park and how the deer population was out of control and there weren't enough aspen trees. And the river had even changed its course because there were no wolves in the park. So they reintroduced wolves into the park. The parks catch the deer. The deer were eating the baby aspen trees, the saplings that were growing. So that allows now more trees to grow. And because there are more trees growing, that actually changes the shape of the landscape and the flow of the river. So the wolves had an indirect impact on the flow of the river. And so they went from no wolves in the park to reintroducing them after decades and decades. And that put back the biodiversity and the ecosystem that used to be there. So same thing with the Delta smelt. The argument is if that fish becomes extinct, or at least in the Colorado River, that's going to disrupt the ecosystem and it's going to have unwanted consequences. Then we've got global impacts, CO2 emissions, and that's where climate change comes from. CO2, methane, and what's the other? There's a greenhouse gas starts with an N. Nitrogen? Yeah, I think it's nitrogen. So those three are the global warming gases that have caused climate change, right? Caused extreme swings of weather patterns and very cold at sometimes, very hot at other times. And this is, it's been proven to be a direct result of how much we're burning fossil fuels. So this all goes back to our use of fossil fuels, and there are even those who say that early on we could have gone with more renewable sorts of fuel. For example, the very first diesel engine was made to run on vegetable oil. But for some reason we decided, no, we've got all this petroleum in the ground, we're going to use that and build our cars and machines to run on fossil fuels instead of renewable fuels. Okay, so those are some environmental considerations. Economic impacts. So we've talked about these concepts before: direct costs, hidden costs. You know what? I'll just say quickly about recycling. I'm all in favor of recycling, but I found out that in the offices here, when they pick up our recycling from the offices, they just put it right in the garbage. It's like, what? Why do we have two trash cans? There's a lot of controversy about recycling. It's not always as helpful as we may want it to be, but it does provide some benefit. So I would say if you have the opportunity to recycle, please do recycle. We've talked about contingency costs, I think, but anyways, things like warranties. If companies make better quality products, they don't have to repair those products as often, and you have fewer injuries to customers that got injured by a faulty product. You can maintain good relationships with your stakeholders and reduce externalities. Externalities are those costs of production that the company does not pay. So when a company pollutes, that pollution goes, it impacts the public. That's called an externality, because the cost of that pollution is external to the company. Then we've got other impacts on society, quality of life. When we have organizations that are sustainable, that means their jobs are going to be more sustainable. Their products are going to be more sustainable. More peace of mind for employees and customers. Less illness and disease coming from pollution, especially in the workplace. Fewer accidents and injuries. More health and wellness for employees. So there are a lot of things companies can do to be sustainable. They can take that information, report on it, let their stakeholders know what they're doing. In general, that can increase their profits. So being more sustainable does not necessarily mean less profits. It can mean more profits. You just have to sometimes be creative in how you do it, to make sure you're being smart. about your costs, controlling your costs. But these are some of the things that organizations can do to pursue what's good for people, what's good for the planet, and what's good for their profits. All right, so we should probably take a break. So we will finish up the chapter on Thursday. And why don't you go ahead and come back at 2:45 and we'll go over the exercise set. No, what is it called? Question. We'll go over the questions so that you have some ideas of what to write about. Okay, so see you at 2:45.